That's really my job, right? If somebody comes in and says, whoa, my room's really messed up, can you do something? And then I go in and figure out for them how to approach using this room and making it usable for professional audio work.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedictine, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood, as well as Jesco Lohan. Hello, Jesco. How are you?
Hi, guys. How's it going? I'm good.
Hi, Malcolm. How are you today?
I'm great. This is exciting. Jesco, I'm a big fan of your crazy, knowledgeable brain. You've been a very, very big help in my life so far. So sweet. This is really great that we're able to have you on.
Sweet. That's awesome.
In case you guys are not familiar with who Jesco is, he's an acoustics expert, like for lack of a better term. He's going to tell us more about that for sure. Right. He runs a website called AcousticsInsider.com. And he's sharing a lot of free content, very valuable free content on how to treat recording studio spaces so that you can use them actually. So that because like there's a lot that goes into treating a room, into improving the acoustics of a room. It's like a science and an art in and of itself. And Jesco is one of those few people who really know what they're doing here. And he's also a member of a mastermind group that I'm a part of, and we meet regularly. And so I'm stoked to have him on and to learn a thing or two about acoustics today.
Awesome.
Also, and I want to say this in the beginning here before we actually start the conversation, Jesco has prepared something for you podcast listeners. He's prepared a guide, a 5-step guide to recording room treatment, like recording room acoustics on a budget. It's specifically made for you, for the Self-Recording Band podcast listeners, for bands recording themselves. And you find that guide if you go to AcousticsInsider.com/self-recording-band.
That's right.
So go there, download it. It's free. Thank you so much for doing this, Jesco. And again, welcome.
Thanks, man. That's very kind of you. A lot of good, very kind information there. And just to like specify, I'm definitely someone who focuses on like home studios as well. You know, like recording home studios. I think that's a space in this like, or a niche in this whole acoustics world that hasn't been properly served yet. And when I started treating rooms, I quickly realized that like people who are building their home studios, who are trying to work professionally from their home studios, be it mixing, be it any type of like audio work, and obviously recording, they're like struggling a lot with all that crazy amounts of insane information that's available on the net, which is just such a mess. And that's really my focus, is like helping you guys at home treating your home studios.
Yeah, and I also forgot to say, by the way, that Jesco is a mixing engineer.
Yeah,
you're a mixing engineer yourself, a platinum award-winning mixing engineer, actually. So we should mention that probably. So
that's true.
He does not only know how to treat rooms, but you're also a mixer yourself, and you've probably experienced those problems yourself before you start to dive into actually like building and optimizing rooms.
Yeah, exactly.
I really love the about section on your website. It says platinum-winning mixing engior, German punctuality and professionalism. Actually, a rocket scientist. No
also
joke.
True.
Probably one of the nicest dudes around.
Perhaps.
Yeah, an actual rocket scientist. Yeah, we need to mention that as well. Like it's like that. That starts to sound pretty crazy, but it's true. Yeah.
So originally I studied aerospace engineering back when what feels like a different life. So I spent 4 years in the UK studying for a master's in something called avionic systems engineering, which is again a niche within aerospace. So focusing on electronics and computer systems in aerospace. And so after that, did a bit of work in that field as well. But I kind of realized at some point when the guy next door was like working on missiles for like fighter jets, and I was just like, this isn't my world. I love the like the engineering behind it, but like this isn't like the place where I want to spend my life. And so that's when I kind of refocused back on music, which I've been doing all my life. But the things I learned definitely find their way into how I approach things now, because in acoustics, there are a lot of moving parts, and you kind of have to take a step back and look at it more like top level, like from the top down to really know what decisions to make when, and to keep in mind how things are supposed to come together, right? And it's that systems aspect that really drives a lot of my thinking and my approach in teaching as well, in how I treat home studios and what to focus on, what to prioritize, that sort of thing.
Right. Now, maybe you should kind of describe what your job is and what that looks like, because I'm sure that a lot of our listeners didn't even know that it existed before this episode happened.
Sure. So, I mean, the easiest kind of scenario is, let's say you got a spare bedroom, maybe a basement, maybe an attic or something in your house, and you want to build a studio in there. And then you kind of bring in your desk and your speaker stands and your speaker, and you sit down. And the first question you ask yourself is, well, where do I set up in this new room? And then you kind of start experimenting around, and maybe you stumble across like Room EQ Wizard, and you start doing some measurements, and before you know it, you're like three days down the line, and your head's smoking, and you have no idea what the fuck's going on. And and it's at that point that you also realize, like, I probably, even if you found a good spot to sit and you decide on where to set up, and you listen to your speakers first, maybe you do a mix, maybe you do like work on a production or something, maybe you record a guitar or something, and you realize just how warped it sounds, just how distorted it sounds in a way, how messed up it is, what you're hearing, and that you really can't trust what you're hearing, and that and that the room has a massive impact on what you hear from your speakers. And so it's at that point that you maybe realize, okay, I need to maybe do some acoustic treatment, right? So improving the sound in the room so that the speakers give you a more honest representation of what's being fed into them, what the material is that it's playing back. And so that's really my job, right? If somebody comes in and says, whoa, my room's really messed up, can you do something? And then I go in and do, based on experience, measurements, hearing tests, I'll assess what's going on in the room and figure out for them how to approach using this room and making it usable for professional audio work, so that you can actually trust what you're hearing, and so you don't have to constantly think about the sound coming out of your sound, your speakers. So you don't have to constantly question whether what you're doing with like an EQ or a compressor, or if you're adding reverb, whether that's actually what's happening in the music, right? So that you can get back to more of an intuitive flow when you're working, so you can get back to also just having fun ultimately, right? Because I mean, this creative process is supposed to be fun, and if you're constantly second guessing yourself, that just goes out the window really quickly, right? So that's kind of what my job is, really, is like improving the sound on one hand, sure, but giving back a sense of trust to your speakers in your room, giving it back a chance, giving back the fun in the music, basically.
Awesome. Like, that already sounds like we need to separate two things here. So one aspect of the whole acoustics thing is treating your room so that you can trust your speakers and you can actually judge what you've been recording or what you're mixing, like what comes out of the speakers.
Sure.
And the other aspect is treating the room so that what you're capturing sounds optimal or sounds the way you want it to, and like instruments in the room sound a certain way. So there's the live room treatment and the control room treatment. Yeah. But in the case of most of our listeners, this is one and the same thing. You know, like many people record in their jam spaces, in their rehearsal rooms, so they have to have the room. The room needs to work as a recording room, but also as the control room.
Yeah.
Now, how would you approach such a situation? Would you just treat a corner of the room as sort of the control area, and would you leave a part of the room more open, or like what? How would you in general approach that? And do you even need to separate it, or is it the same thing?
It's definitely not the same thing. The tools are all the same and the goals are completely different. All right. Oh, to some extent, but the goals are quite different. All right. And the first thing to really understand is that the stakes are much higher in a control room or for a mixing setup. Yeah. The demands on the room are much higher because your everything that you listen to, every move, every decision that you make goes through those speakers. And so the more honest that representation is, the easier and the quicker it will be to make decisions, right? So the demand is higher there, while with a recording setup or recording a live room, sure, there are kind of restraints with what's possible in a really bad room, but you can do a lot with the type of microphone you use, where you place the microphone, where you place the performer, first of all, right? The way that the person performs is more important than anything else in that regard, right? So the priorities are not skewed. That's not the right word, but they're weighted in a different direction, right? So so in that sense, when I approach somebody, or when I approach a room where somebody says, I need to mix and record in this room, I'll always say, okay, look, that's totally fine, but we got to prioritize the mixing setup, because if you make compromises there, especially in a home studio, when the room was never built for that purpose, those compromises are going to have massive consequences on your ability to work, right? While if your recording situation isn't ideal, you can probably work around that to some extent. Yeah, it's much harder to work around issues that you've caused for yourself on a mixing setup if you haven't gone through the steps in the right order and gone through them properly, right? So in that sense, I would always focus on treating the room optimally as best as I can for the mixing setup, and then seeing, ideally, how can we now squeeze in the recording side afterwards? Yeah, that's my personal opinion. Obviously, priorities change depending on what kind of person you are and where your priorities lie in terms of recording and mixing, right? So you might say, well, screw this, I need to squeeze my whole band in this room. Yeah, I can't use a third of the room for my mixing setup. Yeah, so in that case, it's going to end up in the corner. You're going to have a hard time mixing, but that's just the compromise you make, right? So I think that's kind of how you need to think about this. Yeah. One other thing that you can keep in mind is that a mixing setup is always about optimizing for one particular spot in the room where you sit while you work. While if you want to record instruments, especially multiple instruments at the same time, you're trying to optimize for a whole area. And that is actually much more difficult to do. But not just much more difficult to do properly, but also it's obviously you need to think about how you place your treatment, what kind of treatment goes where differently when you're trying to optimize for an entire area rather than just one spot, right? So in that sense, the two are different because the goal is different, and the path that leads to that goal is different as well, right? And then finally, I guess, you need to remember that what you're trying to do in a live room, when you're trying to treat a live room, is you're trying to create a certain sound in that room. And there is no ideal standard for a certain recording room sound, right? So whatever you like is the right recording room sound for you. And so there is no like, look up some numbers on some website and then make them happen. That doesn't exist in the process of treating a live room, right? And so the what you're trying to achieve requires a certain amount of experience, requires a certain amount of knowledge of your taste, in-depth knowledge of your taste, in order to say, okay, I want to take this room in this direction or that direction in terms of sound, right? So very different,
right? Yeah, because we're not trying to get like a reproduction of our speakers to be accurate. We're trying to just make a room sound with a certain character, right? Like if you go and hit a drum, does it sound the way you want it to?
Exactly. And that obviously depends on the type of music, the type of music you want you're recording, or like how the person plays, what kind of sound you're going for, all those things.
Right.
As like with almost any other topic, it's again about like being intentional and having that vision first before you go and treat a live room. I guess like you got to know. I mean, you can obviously experiment, but it sure helps to know where you want to end up and then figure out a way to do that, because like you could go in all sorts of directions. You could have a very, very dry room. You could kind of like take the room out of the equation almost entirely. You can have a very lively room. Like you see, if you just Google recording studio live rooms, you'll see all sorts of different rooms, like shapes and sizes and materials. You'll see brick walls, you'll see wooden walls, you see absorptive materials and everything in between, because it's so much of it is just a matter of taste. Whereas if you look up control rooms, people use different materials, yes, and like also there are different styles, but some principles you'll find over and over again in different control rooms, because it just works universally, because the goal is almost the same every time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, ultimately, what we're trying to do in a control room or mixing scenario is create a sound where the room sound doesn't mess with your own perception of the sound, right? So there's this whole aspect of psychoacoustics, as for example, one of them that's maybe you've heard before is masking, right? And there's frequency masking, so where a certain frequency will mask another frequency very close by. But there's also masking in time, so where one event in time will actually mask an event that comes right after it. Yeah, and so we have these kind of quirks of our hearing based on psychoacoustics. So this actually happens in the brain, right? This doesn't necessarily happen in the ear, but in the kind of a whole interaction of your hearing machine. And what you're trying to do is not have those things happen in the room that mess with your brain's, your hearing machine's ability to kind of understand the music. And there are certain kind of thresholds that we've experimentally figured out over the years of understanding psychoacoustics, where we know, okay, well, if we want to be able to hear a certain sound event from our speakers, then kind of the reverb has to be this low in terms of level in comparison, or there shouldn't be another similar event very close by right afterwards, because it's going to mask what you just heard, right? Or in terms of localization, for example, in terms of figuring out where things sit in the stereo image, right? You don't want a certain sound event, a reflection hitting your ear within a certain time frame, or it's going to mess with your ability to tell where in the stereo field your actual sound event sits, right? So in a control room scenario, we've got these kind of somewhat accurate thresholds or numbers or targets to hit if we want to be able to hear just our speakers properly, and that's much more malleable in a live room scenario, right? Some people like a slapback echo on, well, you guys are the recordists, on what, your snare? I don't know. On your toms, maybe.
Everything.
On everything, yeah, just a fuckload of slapback. Yeah. Some people want it really diffuse, right? Some people like a really long reverb tail, but they want it to be really diffuse. So it's more like a blanket that kind of puts itself across the sound. Some people like things to be quite bright. Some people just want like a really dark and gloomy, long bodied, and so there are very different tastes and goals for this, which is why it's pure art, right? Treating a recording room is basically art.
Yeah, agreed. What would you say about like mixing on headphones only and not worrying about the mixing treatment, like just treating the room as a recording room and like making the decision to just judge things on headphones? Is that an option, especially for like DIY bands, or is there no way around like at least some pair of speakers in some treatment?
No, I think you can definitely do a lot on headphones, and I mean even here in my room, headphones just still feature prominently in any mix that I do. In my view, basically it's like this: you can do just about anything on headphones. It's just that certain parts of it are going to be much harder than on speakers. For example, balancing. So that means figuring out how loud each layer, each instrument in your mix needs to sit in relation to all the other instruments. Yeah, balancing is, in my opinion, very hard to do properly on headphones. And like balancing is like 80% of the mix. Like if you get the balance, if you really nail the balance, like all the layers can sound like shit, it's still going to be a pretty decent mix because you're going to feel the music. But if your balance is off, it doesn't matter how great your snare sounds, right? So that kind of that's why mixing on headphones is quite difficult, and it becomes easier to do that on speakers. And it also, in my opinion, is just more fun to do it on speakers because it's easier, because it's quicker, right? So there's this
and less fatiguing.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So you can do all of this on headphones, and you should definitely get a good pair of headphones. Spend $300, $400 on headphones. Like that is so worth it, because they're gonna last for ages. And if you're gonna do like really detailed reverb work, if you're gonna do really detailed delay work, that sort of thing, if you're really getting down to nitty gritty details, that's gonna be a lot easier to do on proper headphones, just because to do that on speakers, you really need a very, very well treated room. And just like with anything, like you have this kind of 80-20 relationship in terms of getting bang for your buck with treating your room. So getting that amount of detail from your speakers, where you can hear like 0.3 of a dB in like the last part of the reverb tail, that's going to be hard to get in like a home studio scenario. And for those sort of things, headphones are great. So you should definitely get a proper pair of headphones. But ultimately, if you realize that you're fighting your mix, if you're fighting the balancing process, you're probably better off switching over to speakers.
Right. Yeah. Now, most of our community is focusing on the recording side of things, more so than the mixing side of things. So it seems like this would be a great, affordable first step, because like you said, in Canadian at least, like $300 to $600 is going to be an amazing set of headphones that is going to be way better than any $300 to $600 speakers you could buy.
That's right.
By like a long shot, right? Like the investment, you're going to get amazing headphones versus crappy speakers.
Exactly.
And I would agree that if you went with the headphone route, that's a way better initial investment.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's like the first, like you get your first kind of crappy piece of crappy set of speakers. But then the next step up, if not even before that, should be a really good pair of headphones. Like you need it, you will need it eventually. The earlier you get it, the better, sort of thing,
Definitely. What are you using for headphones there? Those
I got my
big, ginormous things look awesomely comfy.
I got my Shure SRH 1340, I believe.
Cool.
And they're amazing. So they come in. There's even a model above them, which both of them sound amazing. They do have very, very tame low end, as in like in terms of level. There's quite little low end. It goes down really low, but it's as in frequency. But it's also quite quiet. So they're not bass heavy headphones. So I actually pushed with a low shelf. I pushed the low end a tiny bit, so it resembles more what I hear from my speakers and what comes out of what comes out of my speakers. The only issue is, so I've had these for 4 years, and I'm not sure if you can see, but literally like 2 weeks ago, they're like little tiny little screws in there that kind of ripped out, and so they still sit on my head, but it's kind of flimsy, and then I need to get them fixed. So I'm not entirely sure about the build quality now.
Yeah, like I had a model down from those, they broke in the same spot.
Yeah, exactly. If you'd asked me like 6 months ago, I would have been like, best headphones ever. And now I'm just like, but they sound amazing. Like the especially the stereo image. I really tried a lot of headphones. I had the Biodynamic DT 990s before, which are great. But I had them for like 10 years, and they came out with a newer version, I guess, lately. And those seem to be much better than those old ones that I had. So that's another one that I can definitely recommend. If you're mixing, not recording, open-backed headphones, I love both of these models, Biodynamic and Shure, interestingly enough. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Cool. Now, if we go, like, let's say, like, we have a recording room, because that's what most of, or if not all of our audience has. So not everyone's mixing. Some are, but not everyone. But almost everyone is recording. So is there a strategy, like taste aside, but is there something that you absolutely need to do or need to tackle first? Are there common problems, especially with like small rooms?
Yeah.
Like the one thing.
Go ahead.
I'm asking for a very specific reason, because the one thing that comes to mind for me, and I noticed that in a lot of recordings when people sent me stuff, is that those small rehearsal rooms, these small typical rooms that bands use, they often sound boxy and sort of muddy. They have a very like pronounced lower mid range, and like it's not the same with every room, of course, but there are some characteristics that I consider typical for a room like that. But I might be wrong here. It's just what I'm hearing. So
I agree.
What would you say? What are the first things that you could actually like tackle first in the situation?
Yeah, I completely agree. So what you're kind of alluding to is early reflections, right? So this is sound bouncing off of all the surfaces, the ceiling, the floor, the walls, but which surfaces that are very close to your instrument or your microphone as you're recording, right? And so the problem that creates is that these reflections happen very quickly after the direct sound, as in the kind of the dry sound, has reached the microphone, right? So you can imagine the dude playing his guitar, and let's just call it, say, an acoustic guitar to make it easier. And so the sound comes out of the guitar, and then there's a direct path to the microphone, right? But then there's one sound path where, just like when you're playing pool, the sound will bounce off of like the sidewall and then into the microphone. But that sidewall, this guy is only like standing like 3 feet, like a meter away from the wall. And so that sound doesn't have to travel very much further than the direct sound. And so it doesn't take very long for it to bounce off that wall. And it'll literally hit the microphone milliseconds, as in thousands, a few thousandths of a second after the direct sound. And our brains can't separate those two sound events. It actually fuses them together. And within like the first kind of 50 milliseconds, we're talking about early reflections, because our brain does this thing where it fuses stuff together. And that part of the sound arriving after the direct sound, as in that part of the reverb of the room, that first slice of the reverb, is to a large extent what tells our brain how that room sounds, because they're so loud, because they don't have to travel very far, right? Sound decreases in volume as it travels. And so these guys are very, very close and very loud. And so our brain's just like, oh yeah, no, I know what this room sounds like, because like that's what the early reflection sounds like, right? And the problem is that once that's baked into the recording, is that you can't get rid of it. It's very, very difficult to try and somehow change our perception of that particular space once it's baked into the recording. Yeah, it's easier to do that with the rear part, the latter part of the reverb. And there are like modern like reverb plugins and stuff that can take care of that pretty well. I'm not sure what your experience is with these de-reverb plugins, but whenever I try them, they never seem to do what I want. It's just like, it's always like fiddling around. You're just like, yeah, it's kind of better, but not really. And so that's the main issue with small rooms, that there's always going to be some surface very close to your performer. And so the character of your room, if it's not treated at all, is very likely baked into the recording. And you, as a mixer, there's very little you can do about that. You can kind of try and mush it with a ton more artificial reverb, but that doesn't usually, it's not a particularly elegant solution. You can kind of tell. And you still have that vibe of the original small room in there. And so the first thing, ideally in a small room, that you want to do is try and reduce the impact of those early reflections, right? Because that will give you more possibilities in terms of what you can do with the recording. It's just going to be a cleaner recording. And so you get more choices, you get more options. Also, those small rooms, not just we can't remove them from the recording once they're in there, but they tend to kind of sound shit. Let's just be frank. Yeah. And and so as a mixer, once you've got that, there's like, you can't fix that. You can't make it suddenly sound good. It's just, it's close to impossible. And so it really helps if in a small room you try and reduce the impact of those early reflections in order to give the mixer more room to play with, pun intended, give them something that is flexible in terms of what you want to do with it, right? So you want to treat those early reflections first. You want to reduce those, and that usually just means looking at where your performer is located, where the sound comes from in terms of the instrument, right? Looking at where the microphone is placed, and then figuring out what's the closest surface to my performer and my microphone, in between my performer and my microphone. What's the closest surface? That's going to be the one probably that's going to cause the most issues. And then it's all just like thinking, you just have to think like you're playing pool or billiards in 3D, right? Sound's going to come out of that instrument. There's going to be some angle where it hits the wall, where when it hits the wall at that angle, it can rebound at this exact same angle, again, like playing pool, and it's going to enter the microphone. So you just kind of have to think about it that way. And then be generous with your treatment. Don't just think you can like take a small strip of like one by 1 foot, like 1 square foot of foam and just stick it in that exact spot. That's not going to do very much. You want to think bigger than that. Yeah.
Egg cartons.
So, yeah, egg cartons, exactly. So that's the way you want to go. that's the standard. That's recently discovered. And so and then just try and cover those spots the best you can with some sort of absorptive material, right? And obviously in like the DIY case, usually that will be some sort of mineral wool, stone wool, or fiberglass. If you can definitely buy proper acoustic foams, that will definitely work very, very well. It's just that they're quite expensive. So they're kind of in terms of bang for your buck, DIY and a DIY approach, you kind of have to think about whether that's something you want to do.
I need to ask something about this, because if you say foam, I know that a lot of people will get that wrong or will be confused by that, because the type of foam that you are mentioning now, that you have mentioned now, is not like the cheap, usually dark, thin
pyramid foam
stuff that everyone just can buy on Amazon for cheap. But it's like Basatec and like the more expensive sorts of foam, and that sort of foam that most people use and buy. I think no one can actually recommend that, because it's like too thin most of the time. It doesn't do very much. So
that's right.
Don't get Jesco wrong here when he's talking about foam. That's a very specific
that you
type of foam.
There. Exactly. So it's in with and just kind of as a sidetrack, in terms of getting absorption that works in the entire audible spectrum, ideally, you need quite a bit of material depth, because the depth is what's going to determine how low down in frequency your material is going to absorb. Generally speaking, where it all relates to the wavelength, right? And you always have to keep in mind that high frequencies have very, very short wavelengths. Like 20 kilohertz has, 3 centimeters? So like just over an inch of a wavelength, right? And down to 100 hertz, which is already 10 feet or 3.5 meters of wavelength, right? 50 hertz is double that. So we're talking going from very, very, very small wavelengths, very short distances in terms of wavelengths, to very, very long wavelengths. And the material that needs to suck up this wavelength has to obviously be somewhat in the realm of that size, of that depth. Yeah, if you go into more detail, you can look up the quarter wavelength rule in terms of figuring out actual frequencies that you're absorbing. But the matter of fact is that you need depth in order to hit long wavelengths, aka low frequencies. And so that's why these very shallow pyramid foams, and don't be confused by those little bumps on top. They're literally just visual. They're just like for visuals. They do nothing. There's no diffusion happening. For diffusion, you need like solid, hard materials. This is foam. It's not going to diffuse anything. It's just going to pretend to absorb something, when really all it does is like probably absorb upwards of, 4, 5, 6K, right? And in terms of doing useful work for you for music, that doesn't really help. Yeah, so you need something that is a lot deeper than that. I tend to say, at the absolute minimum, if you're putting something on the wall just for kind of reflection purposes, at least 4 inches or 10 centimeters, I guess that is 12 centimeters. And if you want to think even remotely approach bass absorption, we're talking 6 inches of material depth. So that's about 16 centimeters. So you need at least six inches or around 16 centimeters if you're even gonna remotely approach anything relating or anything like bass absorption, right? So those are kind of the depths we're talking about here. Yeah? And that's just the material depth. We're not talking about the actual size of the panel. Yeah, as I said before, you don't want something that is like a square foot of material. Always think in like steps of at least 1 or 2 square meters. What is that in feet? I have no idea, but we're talking like at least 3 by 3 foot, panels or surface covered. Yeah. I tend to say when we're talking about these standard absorber panels that come in like, what are they, like 4 by 2 feet sizes, that you always want to go in steps of like 3 of those panels at a time. There's really no point in just buying one of these because it's all about covering surface area. And so if you're going to invest in acoustic panels, buy 3 of those at a time, at a minimum, right? In order to get an effect that you can actually hear that actually makes a difference to what you're doing.
Right.
Awesome. So, but when you say it's about size and depth, are there any DIY materials or items that people might already have that they could repurpose or use? Like I'm thinking about mattresses or whatever.
Sure.
Like if people are on a budget and like they're just starting out, they want to do something with their room. Does it help to use like to put a sofa in the room, to put mattresses against the wall, stuff like that? Does it help in any capacity, in any way?
But it's not meant to absorb sound, right? So its effectiveness, considering how large it is going to be pretty small. Okay, so that's kind of the thing to keep in mind. You can totally put up a bunch of old mattresses. It's going to look like crap. It's going to absorb a ton of high end, but because it's not made for absorbing sound, it's probably going to do very little for your low end, right? And so when you put a lot of these large, high frequency absorbers, large surface areas of high frequency absorption in your room, you're going to really reduce the reverb time in those high frequencies, while the lows and the mids are going to remain uncontrolled. And that can actually work against you because it's gonna unbalance the reverb time in the room even more than it probably already is. And so this is something you can definitely experiment with, and I highly recommend it. If you have some mattresses lying around, or you're like, you just don't have an option to like run out to the store right now and buy some mineral wool, give it a go. Absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things. Acoustics in general is one of those things where you can talk about it a ton, but ultimately you got to gain some experience with it. You got to try it and just see what it actually does, so that you understand what all this stuff is that we're talking about here, and also to get an idea of what it does for you in your daily work, right? Because ultimately that's where it should show its strength. Doesn't matter if you walk in the room and you're like, haha, my room sounds great. It's like when you're sitting there churning out the 10th mix in that 16-track album, right? And then it really makes a difference whether you spend 5 hours on it or 3 hours on it, or if you spend 3 days on it or half a day, So that's where it shows. And that's and that you can only get that once you give it a go, right? So I always say don't worry about making mistakes. You can't really break anything. You can only learn that something doesn't work. And so so in worst case scenario, you can only learn that something doesn't work, right? So best case, you do something, you're just like, that's kind of nice. I kind of like that. How can I do more of that?
Yeah.
And that's why you really want to just get started. And if that means putting up some mattresses, some curtains, go for it.
Question for you.
Awesome.
When you're talking about the depth being like 6 inches, ideally, are you also taking into account the air gap behind these panels? Or
Not yet. At the moment, I'm talking only about actual material, the material core, the insulation material core. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so you could have 6 inches of material and then potentially another 6 inches of air.
That's right.
Like a 12
That's
or
right.
a full foot of treatment. So yeah, in a small room, that's really going to make things small.
I mean, and
if you
that's
want
right.
to go
And I mean,
extreme.
that's kind of the reality of acoustic treatment as well. It requires a lot of space, right? You got to remember that, as I mentioned, sound waves, especially low frequencies, have very long wavelengths, right? So you've got these huge waves sloshing around in your room. You obviously can't see them, but that's what's happening. Yeah. And just imagine that, like, you're trying to break a wave that size, like an actual ocean wave, and all you put in, like, you put a plastic bucket in its path. Like, it doesn't care, it's just gonna wash it away, right? And the way you get you get a change in your room is by you're properly redesigning the sound in the room. You're properly redesigning all the surfaces in the room, because you have those huge wavelengths to take care of that carry a lot of energy, right? And so you gotta put a lot of treatment in your room, or in other words, you're kind of redecorating your room. That's kind of how you think about it. Like you need to, you're properly changing all aspects of the room, and that's what it takes to take care of those huge wavelengths.
Yeah, exactly. And could that overtreatment, like overtreating the high and upper mid-range frequencies while not really affecting the lower mid-range and bass frequencies, could that be part of the reason why I tend to perceive those recording rooms as like muffled, dark, muddy,
exactly
that sort of quality? Because I think that's what many people do. I think not many people do anything about the bass or like the mid-range, right. And that's why it lacks clarity, openness, and it's part two of this question is, if so, what can you do to treat your room but still make it balanced and still retain clarity and air, and like the sense of like this openness, basically.
I mean, the important thing to realize is that pretty much in any small room, just as an empty room, it's already going to be unbalanced in terms of reverb. Like what you're starting out with is already bad, right? Or is already not working in your favor. Yeah. And so you already have a much shorter reverb in the high frequencies than in the lows, just because it's also so much easier to stop high frequencies, again, because of those short wavelengths, right? And so you're starting off with something that is already unbalanced, and your target should be to rebalance it. Yeah. So your focus needs to be, in an ideal world, on just cutting down on low frequency and low mid frequency reverb time. Now, the problem is there's no tool to do that. It doesn't exist, right? So you can't actually just focus broadband on the low frequencies. That's literally impossible. So the next best thing is to try and absorb all of the spectrum, including the highs, more or less, but then see if we can bring back some of that high frequency energy that gives us a sense of the space, of the openness, of the liveliness, right? So in our DIY world, what we're trying to do is reduce everything and then see if we can selectively bring back some reflecting surfaces on top of our absorption that will only reflect high frequencies, right? And you do that through something like a simple kind of type of scatter plate, or I call them diffuser fronts. And it's basically a very simple type of diffuser. And again, because of those wavelengths with high frequencies, if we build a surface that only has surface within the size of those small wavelengths, only those small wavelengths are going to be reflected. And the long wavelengths are going to bend around these surfaces and actually get absorbed, right? And so that's how we can build a surface that only reflects high frequencies on top of our absorber. And now we're sort of getting into the realm of an absorber that works broadband in the mids and lows, but doesn't absorb all the high frequencies. Yeah. And one of the things that you really only learn once you've tried this and once you've gotten some experience with diffusion is that this reverb balance or imbalance in reverb is one cause for a room feeling dead or overdamped, but you don't necessarily need a long reverb time in the highs to make it lively. You can just have diffuse early reflections, so reflected energy that is broken up to give you a sense of space. You don't actually need that energy to linger on very long, aka the reverb time can still be short in the highs, but while you have some of that broken up reflected energy focused on the high frequencies, you still get a sense of space. Your brain is still going to tell you, oh, this room is nice and open, and it feels like there's ambience, but it's not based on pure reverb time, right? And this is obviously, once again, an aspect of psychoacoustics, or a result of psychoacoustics. Our brain decodes early reflections as space, right?
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Malcolm, I know before I know you have some questions prepared for Jesco as well that I found very interesting. So I'd love for you to ask some of these. But before we do that, I want to give you guys a practical example that you can experience right now, because I realized when finishing and finalizing these podcast episodes, as soon as lately I've switched to having my podcast set up here at home in my office and not in my studio anymore. So if you listen to earlier episodes of this podcast compared to this episode, you'll notice a huge difference in how my voice sounds on the show, and with the same mic and everything. And if you also compare Malcolm's voice to my voice on the recent episodes, you're gonna hear a big difference there as well. Malcolm is sitting in a control room, and Malcolm has probably absorbers above him. I guess you have some sort of cloud, probably, and I don't. I have
my entire ceiling's cloud.
Exactly, and you can tell because I don't have this above me. So I get these early reflections from right above my head, and you can tell my voice. You can really hear the room, especially if you compare it to the really dry recording that Malcolm has. So there you can already hear in this episode probably you can already hear the impact of a small room like that and the early reflections. It doesn't sound like a long reverb tail. It's just a short sort of echo that kind of gets mixed with my voice, and mine just sounds indirect and not as good, basically, as Malcolm. Just because what you hear from Malcolm is the sound of his voice directly into the mic and not much else. So you can experience that right away, and it's a pretty drastic change from the early episodes to right now when I switched my setup here. So I just want to say that so you can hear what we're talking about right now.
You know what we should do as a fun experiment is just all three of us do a little session where a little experiment where we move back from our microphones while we're talking, so that you get increasingly more room in the recording, so you and the listener can tell.
Right.
Just get a direct comparison between three different small rooms, just for fun, just to see what they sound like, and then you can focus on pay attention to, first of all, the length of the reverb, the amount of reverb. Is it very high in level? As in, is it loud in comparison between the three of us?
Right.
Is it dry? Yeah. Is it dark? Is it bright? Right. So I'm going to start. I'm recording into a Rode NT1A condenser. So I'm just going to get really close, and I hope I'm not going to break my microphone or the levels here. So I'm now maybe half a foot from the microphone. And so now as I'm moving back, so this was my original position, maybe a foot and a half from the microphone. Now I'm maybe 2 feet from the microphone. And now I'm moving back to maybe 3 feet from the microphone. And now I'm about 4 feet from the microphone, right? So obviously now I'm probably very quiet, and also you can hear a lot of the room in the recording. So now, Benedict, do you want to do the same thing?
Absolutely. That was already great. I could absolutely tell.
Yeah.
So let's start. So right now I'm basically eating the mic. I'm as close as I can get to the SM7. Now I'm moving back half a foot or so to my original position. Now I'm moving back that's probably a foot. Now now I'm away 2 to 3 feet, I guess. And now I'm moving all the way to the back wall here of my small office. And now I'm obviously also pretty quiet, and my room sounds terrible, and you should really hear some flutter, some echo, I guess, at least. And now I'm going back while I'm talking, and now I'm in my original position again, very close to the mic.
Awesome.
Nice. All right. Come on. I am literally touching the mic. Share this podcast. And now I am heading back. I'm now about a foot away. And by the way, it was Benny's birthday yesterday. So everybody give Benny a shout.
Oh, yes. Happy birthday, Benedict.
Thank you.
Now I'm 3 feet away. Hello, hello, hello. Check, check, check. And I'm going to head back to the back wall. I am sitting back on the couch at the back of the room, and this is what it sounds like. Check 1, 2. I'm talking louder, though. I'm going to try and just talk the normal volume. See how that is. Cool. All right, and now I'm back.
Interesting.
Awesome. Now, what you probably heard now is, I guess, when I moved back, I guess it wasn't as much of a volume change as it was with Malcolm. And that's partly,
right.
I mean, we both use dynamic microphones, by the way. It's not a condenser mic, so they both get really quiet.
Malcolm, which one are you using again?
This is the Rode Procaster.
Gotcha.
Oh, yeah, I'm using the SM7, the Shure. So they're both dynamic microphones. So they get very quiet if you move away from them. But in a room like mine, where you have this, like a whole bunch of like reflections, and the reflections are pretty loud, I assume there's still more level on the mic when I move away from it. Whereas with Malcolm, when you move to the back wall, I could almost not hear you.
Barely hear you.
Interesting.
Yeah, you were pretty much gone. Yeah,
very interesting.
How was it, Benedict? How was it in my room and with the condenser microphone in comparison?
Yeah, like you with the Rode, the condenser microphone, the Rode, and your room, it sounded to me pretty consistent. Like the room got louder when you moved away, but it didn't change the sound as much. And also, it was not nearly as quiet as with...
Yeah. The volume stayed up as well.
Yeah, stayed up as well. It was not nearly as quiet as with Malcolm. Like, it got a little quieter, of course, but not as drastic as with Malcolm. And I felt like the room was sounding, or the sound of your voice was like pretty consistent. Like it got a little quieter. It got the sense of space was increased, of course, but it didn't get worse.
Right.
Yeah, it was kind of like the reverb and room got added to the more or less character of your voice.
Yeah.
Obviously, there was a low end,
and that's something we would kind of expect more with the condenser microphone as well, wouldn't we? Mm-hmm. Right, because it's much more sensitive than the dynamic microphones. The pickup pattern is probably, it's definitely different. It's probably wider than it is with both of your microphones, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was interesting. Cool, awesome. So I'm curious to hear your hear what you say. If you noticed that, and I'm curious to listen back to that as well as soon as it's like processed, because I'm listening to the...
because obviously we didn't
hear our own, and also we're hearing like the shitty internet compression and not the raw recording. So I'm curious to hear this whole thing when it's finished. But now, Malcolm, to your very specific questions for Jesco, I'm curious to hear some of these answers.
In advance, sorry to the audience, because these questions are like...
Yeah, hit me up.
Questions I have, but hopefully there's something you can glean from them. But Jesco, talking about...
Then I won't answer them.
Talking about experimenting, like you said, you can just do things like bring a mattress in and see what happens. There's you can't really break anything. I recently rose my speakers up like maybe 2.5 inches.
Sure.
And it seemed to me like a dramatic difference.
Okay.
And I was quite surprised initially by how much of a difference it kind of seemed like in my mixing position. And then I tried to think why. And my theories are that I'm now skipping the desk a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because I was pretty low. And
possible.
So I'm now a little bit above it. And then also, I don't know how much you guys can see from my camera. I'm trying to go full screen here so you can't see the traps on either side of me. But now my speakers are also more further into the kind of depth of where my absorbers are, right? So they're kind of getting closer towards center. So in theory, the spread of the speaker is going to hit more of those panels as well. That was my guesses, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on why I would have sensed such a change from just a few inches in height. Cool.
All of those. all of those reasons. I mean, that's the thing. Like, I mean, just moving the speakers a little bit, you're going to get potentially a whole range of changes. I don't know. Did you do this just by raising your speaker stands, or did you put in like those decouplers, or why did you raise them in the first place?
I put in decouplers. Yeah. So I have speaker stands, and then I put decouplers on top of the stand, and then the speaker sits on top of it now.
And the decoupler is the reason for the rise of the speaker?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So obviously we've got the decoupler potentially, hopefully doing its job, right?
Yeah. Now the stands have one built into it as well, so it's kind of like another one. Okay. I just bought them for height.
Okay. I mean, still though, like it's something's going to change in terms of just how the speaker sits on the stand, in dynamically, as in how it moves on the stand, right? If those speaker decouplers work, and that's a whole different discussion, then there's going to be some change there for those reasons. The change in height is going to be just purely in the room is going to make a difference, right? So the speakers will play into the room slightly differently. Although that totally depends on your room, how big that impact is.
Right.
Same with the desk. The desk reflection most definitely is going to change to some extent, but it very much depends on your exact speaker model and the dispersion pattern of your speaker, how that changes, right? So it might have been that you had a very strong desk reflection before, which has now reduced. It might be the opposite. I've seen all of this happen, right? So, so that's why I'm saying all of the above,
right.
Yeah. And it's very difficult to nail it down to one specific reason of those potentialities.
Right.
Yeah. You are going to get a big change, and there are a multitude of potential reasons for that, and they all probably work together to give you that change. Yeah.
Right.
That's why when people consider using a standing desk with their mixing setup, which gets thrown around every once in a while, and I'm just like, bad idea.
As far as mixing goes, yeah.
As far as consistency goes, because you're going to change the sound drastically. I mean, obviously, first of all, you have to build some sort of setup where the speakers get moved along with the desk.
You mean those sort of standing desks that you can change, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. That's what people are thinking, like those motorized desks where you're like, oh, I don't want to sit anymore. I'm going to stand up and walk on my treadmill for the next half hour. But you need to like move your speakers alongside your desk.
Like
sorry, what minute? Go ahead. Make it.
Yeah.
Oh damn, hippies!
Hippies and artists, I tell you.
So, hippies are increasing at a rate of 5 drum circles an hour. So I don't know if you saw that South Park episode. So the speakers are gonna increase. The speakers are gonna change. The sound from the speakers is going to change massively, and the key, or one of the keys to getting consistent results from your mixes, as in doing the same work over and over and over again, is having a consistent sound from your speakers. And there are many, many things that will change how you perceive the sound. Amongst them, obviously, moving the speakers, but also changing the volume while you're listening is going to drastically change how you perceive what you're hearing.
Right.
Yeah. So there are a lot of these little gremlins in the chain of hearing that are going to mess up the consistency of what you're hearing. And if you move your speakers like 3 times a day because you're moving your desk up and down, unless you're a very experienced mixer, it's probably going to make your life a living hell. But that's just a side note on your question of why the sound changed.
What I find interesting about this is that we tend to always, when we think about speaker placement and acoustics in general, we tend to think about like the back and forth and left and right of our room, but we kind of often ignore the up and down aspect, and it's just the same. Like it's the same principles apply. So if you most people understand that if you increase or decrease the distance from your wall, like the speaker distance from the wall, that this is going to change the sound. But if you're like increasing or decreasing the height, you just increase or decrease the distance from the floor and ceiling, which is the same thing.
That's right.
Like, but it's interesting because I tend to forget that as well. Sometimes I think a lot about symmetry, left and right, and like back and forth.
Sure.
But like there are more than 4 corners and more than 4 walls in a room. So
right, yeah,
that's right.
It's harder to control the up and down, I guess.
Yeah, and just for people now, if you're listening and you're now like thinking, okay, then how am I ever going to find the right position for my speakers? So just a couple of words of soothing, maybe. The way I like to do it is I just fix certain aspects of this problem in place, right? So I'm, for example, always going to say, my chair is this high, my ears are this high, therefore my speakers are going to be at this height, which is my ear height. And I'm just going to fix that height. Because then I've got one less variable that I need to optimize. Yeah, I can still optimize how far from the front wall I am. I can still mess with the spread of the speakers, like left to right. I can still mess with how far away I am from the speakers. Yeah, so there are still plenty of variables that I can use to optimize the sound. And it's much easier to just say, I'm going to fix certain variables in place because it's just going to make my life so much easier, right? And And that's one way you can reduce the complexity of this problem.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah,
thank you.
I'm really shocked at how many people don't utilize the working at the same volume trick. That constantly blows my mind that people mix at different volumes every day, and it's like how do you manage to do that? I don't get it, but
So funny story. I went to my mastering engineer, this guy in Hamburg, Hans Philipp Graf, HP mastering. In my opinion, the best mastering engineer ever, but I think everybody thinks that of their mastering engineer. But so this guy, I went and I actually wanted to interview him for my YouTube channel, and we started talking, and like after 2 hours, I was just like, shit, I should have put up my microphone and started recording and right at the start. But so I was just like, so how do you do with this volume thing, right? Like, I'm sure you kind of standardize your volume and then blah, blah, blah. And he was just like, no, I don't do any of that. And I'm just like, how? and I was thinking about that. Like, I've thought about it quite a bit. And what I realized is that he works extremely intuitively, right? He's one of those people who literally does what we all think we should be able to do, where you literally just intuitively correctly judge what you're hearing. And I definitely can't do that nearly as well. And like, I get sidetracked. I get my taste drifts within minutes, and I'll mess up a mix if I don't consistently remind myself of what my target is with references. And if I religiously stick to the same volume. And he doesn't need that. And I was just like, how? And I think there are people out there. I don't know. Yeah, Malcolm, like, do you do that? Like what's...
I standardize, I'm like almost always working at the same volume. I've got a dim switch that I go to. And then I do crank things up, but I'm always going to put it back to the same spot. And that totally works for me. I got that from doing like television mixes and stuff like that. That is really common in post world. And I know a lot of mastering guys that do it. And then it's just like, well, this makes sense to bring into my mixing workflow. I try to do it even while I'm tracking. But invariably, while you're tracking, things get loud. But I'm not saying that you can't. Yeah, you can definitely get good results without doing it, because most people do.
Then I think those are the exception, right? I mean, what I realize is like, I think those guys are like the exception that prove the rule. That for the rest of us, it's like, especially if you're starting out, if you're still learning. But even if you're like, if you're an experienced mixer, and I mean, loads of the top guys do it, right? I mean, somebody like Dave Pensado on his long-running show, I don't know how many episodes he's done talking about referencing, right? I mean, I think like 99% of the people do it. And then there's like that one weirdo off percent who have like perfect taste somehow, and they can do it without, and they just like twist the knob and just like, I like this, and then it's actually good, and it's actually the right thing to do, you know?
That's while we've been having this conversation, I was thinking about Joey Sturgis, and his room literally doesn't have treatment. It's just like this wooden room, and he can obviously do great work.
Exception to the rule.
Yeah, it's like okay. Don't copy that guy because he's a freak of nature.
And some people make it like, some people get, I mean, what I've realized is that not everybody needs the same amount of treatment.
Right.
As in, not everybody needs to go down that rabbit hole as far as it goes. Lots of people do amazing work with just very, very basic treatment, right? Because you can outwork, to some extent, a bad sounding room with very, very structured and systematic workflow. If you have your tricks, mixing tricks, your ways of checking whether you're hitting your target, if you've got those figured out, you can work around certain problems in the room. And some people are so good at it that they don't need any treatment whatsoever. And most of us will for most of us, our work will drastically improve with just some treatment. And then there are some people who are just like, I want the best of the best just because I'm an addict and I want to. And they will go and like hire Northwood Acoustics and like pay 100,000 euros to build a spaceship for them, you know, that doesn't have sound. I don't know what I'm talking about. But yeah, so like those So there's a small percentage that want to go that far, or that need not. Yeah, I don't think anybody needs to go that far, to be honest. I think it's one of those things where there's a certain percentage of people who work at a level like Sterling Sound in New York and in the States. I think they opened in Nashville as well, right? Who work at a level where it just makes their life easier when they have that quality of a room.
Right.
But for the rest of us, we can do very, very satisfying work with a much more basic version of treatment in our rooms. And then there are some people who just need like a panel here and a panel there. And then there's some like Joey Sturgis who just like throw their old Adam 7Xs on a desk and just call it a day, you know?
Yeah, get to work.
But like, really be careful here, like people, and don't think you can do that as well, and like copying those unicorns, because people tend to like those people because it's easy. So I know for a fact that a lot of listeners hear this and they'll say, okay, well, if it works for them, it will probably work for me as well. Or they ignore the fact that 99% of all great mixers do something with their treatment and like that it really matters to them and makes a difference. And then they see that one Joey Sturgis, or they see an interview with Andrew Sheps, who has this big ass old Tannoy speakers in a really small room, and his only treatment is a carpet on the wall, like a piece of carpet. Like, you know, and like,
I didn't know that. And, that's so funny.
Like they see. Did you know that? Like he's been mixing on the same 80s Tannoy speakers for I don't know how long, like big ass speakers right in front of him, and he mixes really, 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 really loud. He says he always wants to feel the kick and snare, and like like he's got no treatment. It's like an office in his home with like a carpet on the wall. That's it. So, and then he checks on headphones as well. But you know, and then people see this, and they tend to gravitate towards those people and ignore 99% of all the others, like who do something different.
Yeah. So, and here's the thing, right? You don't want to judge whether you need something just by somebody else doing something. What is going to tell you whether you should think about acoustic treatment is how easy it is for you to do your work. How, like, what kind of mistakes are you making while you mix, for example, while you record? How difficult is it for you to balance that bass line that you recorded, that guitar that you recorded, that vocal that you recorded, right? How consistent are your mixes when you take them out to the car? Yeah, it's your work that is going to tell you what you should potentially do, or where there is room for improvement. But that was bad. Anyway, so I thought it would work as I was doing it, but then it quickly fell apart. So so your work is what is going to give you indicators of whether you might want to look at acoustic treatment. Yeah, and in particular, it's how difficult are you finding it to judge what you're hearing? I mean, that's the first one, right? If you're constantly asking yourself, is this what's actually happening in the music? That's a clear indicator that you can probably improve the sound in your room. If you're making consistent mistakes, as in you take your mix out to the car and it's always bass heavy, that's a clear indicator that you need to fix something about the sound in your room, because that means it's telling you something wrong that you're compensating for every single time, and it shows up every single time when you take the mix out of the room. Yeah. Same with the high end to some extent. If you've just got trouble balancing, right, kick and bass, right? If you just can't tell where does that kick end, where does the bass note start? Does the kick, the next kick, already overlap with the last bass note? If you can't tell whether that's happening, that's an indicator that your rooms that you might want to improve the bass response in your room, because it's just going to make that easier for you, right? So don't look at what other people are doing. Look at what your own work is telling you and how it feels to do the work as you're doing it. That's going to tell you what you should be doing, what you should focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, if you are a self-recording band and if you're working with mixing engineers, for example, which a lot of people do, then just listen to their feedback or ask for feedback and then improve your room. A mixer will probably tell you that all your recordings and every single track have some sort of issue that might come from your room. So take that seriously and improve before you do the next production. So we've had that a couple of times, Malcolm and I, where people sent us stuff and we just said, hey, you might want to retrack those vocals and do XYZ to solve that problem. Or like all your tracks seem to have a problem here and it would really be a good idea to do something about it. And don't ignore that sort of stuff, but just learn that way, learn about your room and then tackle those issues that you have. Yeah. I totally agree with that.
And
absolutely.
Just talking about something that I put in the PDF for you guys as well, if you want to download that, in order to just a quick way to judge in your own recording room whether you've got issues. I think there are two ways to do this. One is in terms of one is to just focus on how hard it is to understand another person while you're talking. So not even while you're playing, but while you're talking, while you're conversing with your bandmate, right? How hard is it to understand them? How hard is it for them to understand you? Right? That's an indicator of speech intelligibility, which is a difficult word just to explain that there's too much reflection stuff going on, too long reverbs and too many reflections in that range of that frequency range of your vocals, right? So if you're having trouble understanding your bandmate, then that's an indicator that you might want to look at reducing those early reflections that I talked about before, right? Because those are the ones that cause problems understanding your bandmate. If you're a bassist or a drummer and you're having trouble finding locking in the groove with the bassist or the drummer, depending on who you are, right? If those two can't figure out their groove, if they're constantly fighting each other, if they're having trouble finding their flow, that might be an indicator that you should look at some bass control, some bass absorption, right? Because if you are fighting long reverb times and standing waves in the low end, those will make it really difficult for you to hear what the other person is doing, or what's happening in the low end, what the other instruments are doing in the low end. And in particular, obviously with bass and kick, it's particularly important that those two that find their place, right? Find their groove, find their pocket. So that's something you can focus on. Your room will tell you what you need to know, what you need to do, if you know what you're listening out for, right? So I think those are two indicators that you want to pay attention to, that are clear signs that you can make your life easier just by doing some basic treatment, right? And then obviously you can then see if you can hear those problems in your recordings as well once you've recorded stuff. But even before then, it's literally just walking in the room while you're talking, while you're performing. That will tell you whether there's potential for you to improve what's going on in your room, and that all this will improve your performance as well, right? I mean, it's like acoustics is a force multiplier. It doesn't solve any issues itself; it just improves everything else, right? So if you've got certain amount of control, and it becomes so much easier to, let's say, find the pocket with your drummer if you're a bassist, your performance will improve, which in turn will improve your recording, because the performance is the most important part of the recording.
Preach.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's like one ball gets the next ball rolling. Yeah. And so that's why acoustics is so interesting in a way, because it's that more force multiplier, and it just makes everything easier that you do, while at the same time not solving any problems in itself.
Right.
Yeah. And also what makes it so difficult to judge whether you've actually improved things. Those things don't show up just they do obviously show up to some extent in the minute you put up those panels. But it is as you start working in that room that the benefit really starts to show. And ultimately, the best indicator that you've solved a problem is when you don't need to think about it anymore. Like once you've done this and you're just like 3 months down the line, you're just like, for some reason, like I'm not even questioning what the bassist is doing anymore. Like I'm not like, it just works. I'm not even thinking about it anymore. This used to be such an issue. Now I don't even think about it anymore. That's when it's working, you know? And so that's just to give you some kind of indicator of what to look out for in your own rooms.
Awesome.
It'll even improve your writing as a result, because of
everything.
That being able to hear that everybody's on the same page.
Exactly.
It goes a long way.
Yeah.
That's great.
And just as a reminder that like all this, I've put all this together in the PDF for you, right? At acousticsinsider.com/self-recording band. So a lot of the stuff that we've talked through right now is in those 5 steps to give you a clear path through figuring out what you need to do in your particular practice room, rehearsal room, recording room, and come up with a strategy to treat it.
That's so awesome. Thank you again for doing that. And Malcolm, again, is there anything left here?
I think we'd be here all day if we kept going. I don't want to take any more of Jesco's time.
I'm good.
These are all.
I mean, pandemic. We're just entering the second lockdown. Like, where
we'll be here all month.
Where am I going to go? Let's talk about acoustics. I mean, hit me up if you have any more. By all means, I've got time.
I mean, the one that really like, I don't know if that was meant for like more recording rooms or mixing rooms, but Malcolm, you put down here: is there such a thing as too much treatment? That one's interesting for me as well. Like, did you mean recording rooms or mixing rooms, or what did you mean?
I meant mixing room because I have quite a small room and I'm continually filling up space with more treatment. So it makes me wonder, can I go too far?
Yes and no. So generally speaking, let's start with no, because ultimately the most modern kind of research and most modern approaches to control room design show that it's best to simply try and remove the room altogether. Yeah, because ultimately you're never going to get a cleaner signal from your speakers than if they're not in a room at all.
Right.
If you could put if you could build a little hut out of what do they call them? What is it called? Straw bales? Hay bales? What's the word I'm looking for here? Malcolm,
I know what you mean. I don't know the English word.
I mean, hay bales is a thing.
Hay bales.
I live on a farm, so
there you go. That's the word I was looking for. Hay bales. So let's say you build a hut made out of hay bales, right? So they let pretty much all the sound through, everything through except for what they absorb, right? So you could put a little hut out of hay bales and then put your speakers in there. It would sound fantastic because you literally be listening to only the speakers, and you're never going to get a cleaner signal than if you just have speakers. Yeah, assuming that your speakers give you a perfect representation of what you're feeding them with, but let's say that's a given, right? So as soon as you start putting a room around it, you're creating all sorts of issues. And so the most modern idea to control room design is to just try and remove any impact the room has on the speakers as best as you can, right? And in that sense, you can't, since that's in practice, that's pretty much not possible. You can't really have too much treatment. Yeah, because you're just going to get closer and closer and closer to that goal of removing the room completely. There are two caveats to this. The first one is that obviously, once you are in a non-existing room, sure, the speakers sound great, but it's going to be terrible to sit in that room and spend any time there, right? It's not going to be a pleasant room to be in, right? So, you don't want to while you want to try and remove any effect the room has on the speakers, you don't necessarily want to remove the room completely in terms of what you're perceiving as a person in the room. And there are certain kind of ways you can find a balance between those two requirements. On the other side, if you do too much purely mid and high frequency treatment, then you'll end up with that really unbalanced reverb time that we talked about before, right? And sure, you can do too much high frequency absorption. You can do too much just high and mid frequency absorption, which is going to unbalance your room. And so in that sense, yes. But if we're talking about proper full range treatment, you can't really go too far, because in practice, it's not actually possible. Like, there's just not enough space to put that so much treatment in your room that the room disappears. It's literally impossible to do.
You're always going to have a floor, right? Like,
you're always going to have a floor. That's that's one thing. Yeah, exactly.
And a desk.
And a desk, and probably some furniture and stuff, right? So, so I don't think there's any. You don't really need to be afraid of doing too much. You can potentially unbalance the room more than you would like, but in terms of overall treatment, I don't think you can go too far.
Cool. So be intentional at least.
Yeah.
Great.
Awesome. Well, again, The guide is, you can find this at acousticsinsider.com/self-recording-band. I would also want to mention that, Jesco, you have not only your website and like the free guides and everything you've been doing for a while, you've also got some courses and like other stuff and program and coaching and things you do. So what do you have there for people if they want to dive deeper into this? Like, first of all, they should consume everything you have for free, of course, but what else can they do if they really want to learn these things?
Yeah, I mean, you should definitely sign up to my email list and just be part of my gang, where I kind of send out weekly tidbits of information and interviews and just analyses and interesting things that I've thought about and figured out about acoustics. But if you want to treat your room yourself, I've got 2 programs that I just recently finished, and I'm actually relaunching again, most likely beginning of February. So that's a course on building your own bass trap, building your own broadband absorber in combination with this simple diffuser front that I talked about before, right? So it's a tool that I developed specifically for these small rooms. So kind of a best bang for your buck acoustic tool, simple to build, but still looks good and obviously works is intended to solve, in particular, small room issues while working on a budget. And then together with that, a course on placing your panels, right? Because obviously, depending on what your room looks like, especially if you're working from like an asymmetrical, oddly shaped kind of weird room, it quickly becomes difficult to figure out, where do I need to place my panels? Where should I start with the placement? Which parts of the room are the most important? Like the front of the room, the back of the room. People talk about this all the time. Start with sidewall reflections, ceiling clouds. Like, how do you work through this in a systematic way to figure out where everything needs to go? So I've got this kind of double pack of 2 courses that you can get if you sign up to my email list, and I'll launch those again in February. And then obviously, if you want more personal help, I've got I definitely coach people online. And there's a form you can fill out on acousticsinsider.com to get in touch with me and figure out if that's something that works for you, if that's something we want to do together. And then there's a lot of different ideas and programs in the pipeline. So something that I'm working on right now, but it's going to be a bit of time until that gets released, is a course on acoustic measurements, right? Because those tend to confuse people a lot, and they're very, very. It's a rabbit hole you can get lost in very easily, and so I'm trying to put a program together that shows you the essentials of measurements, as in the stuff that you actually need to know in order to perform proper acoustic measurements, and then understand them properly, and do this kind of before and after comparison, figure out what is the situation in my room right now, what are some targets that I want to meet, and then comparing the results in the finished room to figure out if you've actually reached those target numbers. And that's, I think, really important, because ultimately it's so hard to know whether your treatment is actually working. Like, that's a really hard question to answer. Does this actually work? And there are tons of ways you can get an idea of whether it's working, but ultimately there's nothing like just having some hard numbers to look at and some proper targets to reach to figure out whether you've solved those issues in your room, right? And so that's what that course is about. But again, there's going to be a while till that comes out. I've got a course on subwoofer placement in the works. There's a ton of different other ideas that are sort of going to happen in the long run. But
cool.
Yeah, for now it's about building a broadband bass trap panel, combined absorber diffuser sort of, and figuring out how to use that to really get the best out of your room for the smallest amount of money, right? Because that's what we're trying to do in our DIY studios, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds super great. And yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think every dollar and an hour I've put into this topic and building panels and like just anything that I've put into treatment has paid me back tenfold. It's just one of those things that's always a good investment. It's worth knowing this stuff. Yeah. And what it'll do for your workflow is just going to make it so worth it.
Yeah. And I mean, I really focus on sound engineers, professionals who you don't want to become an acoustician yourself, right? You don't need to be an acoustics guru yourself. So my focus really is on teaching what you actually need to know and ignoring all the other stuff, right? Because
the 80-20.
The 80-20, yeah. And like, you need to get back to working on music. And it helps a lot to know the fundamentals, to know the stuff that actually matters for your work. But all the other stuff, like, it doesn't matter to you, you know? And so I really try and walk that line carefully to not leave stuff out that you should know, but also not to get into detail where it's not going to help you, you know? So that's kind of, so that's really my focus in helping somebody like you, Malcolm, and like you, Benedict, to learn and improve your work, but not get lost in detail that is unnecessary.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very important aspect of it. Like, there are some of us who actually like topics like these, but most of us, of course, would just go back to mixing and recording. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
So not everyone's a rocket scientist. So and I want to also mention that you, Jesco, you did a Q&A session before for my beta students of my course of the Self-Recording Band Academy. Right, yeah. So if you join that program, if you sign up for that, there is a bonus module in there where, like, my students asked Jesco a bunch of questions. Some of them are in the same direction as the stuff we've been talking about today, but some of them are, about different issues. It's been a very cool webinar sort of, thing and a Q&A session. So
that was fun, I remember.
Yeah. So that's included in the Self-Recording Band Academy course as a bonus module. And between that, this episode, Jesco's free material, and of course his courses and coaching, I feel like there's more than enough you would ever want to know and you would ever need to make great recordings and great art on your own DIY style. So really dive into all these things and you will notice a big difference in the end. And if you invest in some of it, be it Jesco's coaching or courses or whatever, it will definitely be worth it. And as Malcolm said, it will probably pay you back. And it's probably a better investment than any piece of gear that you've been eyeing for a while. So
definitely,
I'm pretty confident with that. So thank you again for your time, Jesco.
That was a lot of fun.
This.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. That was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Cool. Awesome. Then, I think if people have follow-up questions or if you are confused with any of the stuff that we've been talking about today, just write us an email or post in the community. We'll do our best to answer. And if you don't know the answer, we just ask Jesco.
But I'll be around somewhere, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So thank you for listening. Thank you, Jesco. And thank you, Malcolm, as always, of course. And then, bye.
See you guys.
See you next week.
Bye.